So last week I read to you from the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 22. If men strive together and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart, and yet no harm follow, he shall surely be fined according as the woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. This week, we're going to get to what the heck I was on about with reading that, but I also want to read to you from the book of Shout Your Abortion. This is a real activism website and organization. Abortion bans, quote, are intended to keep poor people in poverty and keep white people in charge of everything. This has been a reading from the book of Shout Your Abortion. So, I said we were going to talk about abortion and Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is the big abortion case currently working its way through the Supreme Court. And this is the context in which I want to talk about it through the lens of these two incompatible kinds of first principles. And I have been suggesting throughout that when we have these fights in public, when we go on the op-ed page or whatever, and we talk about, poor black people, or, this is all about keeping white people in charge of everything, right? That is a smokescreen to disguise a deeper debate between these two theological sets of first principles. I'm going to call one the Imago Dei set of first principles, which is that every human being is created in the image of God and therefore has the right to life. And I'm going to call the other one the clump of cells first principles, which is the premise that a fetus up to a certain point, indeed perhaps even up to birth, is merely a concatenation of biological stuff, material, just matter, right? And the reason I want to have the debate from that perspective is because I think that underlies the fury with which we approach one another. And it is not as if I cannot understand there might be hard cases, edge cases, reasons why you need to terminate a pregnancy that is, not at all viable, that threatens the life of the mother, right? All of these difficult cases, which, as we know, make bad law, right? It is not as if I think it's impossible to have those conversations. It's just that I don't believe that is the conversation we are having at a national level in the Supreme Court. What we're really doing is fighting for the right to have those edge case discussions among people in localities, right? Over questions that real people might get together and decide in states and in local legislatures, right? But that is not the question that we are having at the state level, and it is demonstrated by the abortion activist rhetoric that what they really believe is that this is a clump of cells to be jettisoned in service to the total autonomy of the mother, right? And so I really do think that even though reasonable people can have reasonable discussions about difficult, extreme cases in abortion, basically, that is not what we are arguing about in the Supreme Court, and most of that is just a smokescreen to distract from this fundamental first principles clash, right? That the people have been denied the opportunity to have this conversation on the basis of American principles, on the basis of those founding document principles that I articulated last week in the first part of this two-part series, right? That every human being is endowed by his creator with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They are inalienable. They come from God. Governments can protect them, but they cannot bestow them or take them away. If people who agree on those first principles were allowed to have the discussion about what kinds of prudential moderations they might have in these very extreme cases, these extremely rare cases, right? That would be one thing. But instead, what has happened is that Roe v. Wade and Casey have completely obliterated that discussion and have set us on a track to total disagreement with one another at the level of first principles, at the level of, is this being in the image of God, or is this being a clump of cells? That's the argument that we're having, and it conditions everything else, all of our nattering, even on the conservative side. Obviously I have one position on this side of the debate. I am a pro-life extremist, you might say. But even when conservatives come out and say, well, it's not, these abortion clinics aren't proceeding in a healthy way, right? That's also kind of a distraction, because really what the people who make those arguments believe at a foundational level is a much more basic thing, that this is a person. I am going to begin by reading to you some selections from the oral arguments in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization so that we can see how this sort of thing works. And then we're going to get into the history of this kind of first principle debate and how it might be that we could have this argument in a less destructive, partisan, and hateful way. So first of all, to review, since not everybody is a nerd like me, right? Not everybody's following the news all the time, right? Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization is a court case currently in front of the Supreme Court. They've heard oral arguments already. Decision is forthcoming. In Mississippi, there is a law that bans abortion at 15 weeks of pregnancy, and this is before the sort of line of what is called fetal viability. And one of the major arguments in the pro-life camp is that this is an arbitrary line, but because of those prior court cases that I mentioned, up to 24 weeks, right, you consider to have a sort of right to an abortion. This Mississippi law changes that, right, shrinks the window of time in which people can have abortions. And so if the Supreme Court decides to uphold the law, then the limit on abortion will be sort of more of an open field, right? States will be able to decide either in whole or in part whether they are, going to permit and allow abortion. So that's the question on the table. That's the argument that people are having. But I want to read to you just from selections of the argument for the pro-life side and the argument for the pro-abortion or the pro-choice side, as they call it, right? So here's the pro-life argument first and foremost. This is Scott G. Stewart on behalf of the petitioners. The petitioners are the, in favor of being able to ban abortions side, roughly speaking. Stewart says, Roe and Casey haunt our country. They have no basis in the Constitution. They have no home in our history of traditions. They've damaged the democratic process. They've poisoned the law. They've choked off compromise. So some of this is what I was talking about before, right? That we are now in this position because this has been cut off from debate between Americans in localities. We are now in this position of screaming at one another about first principles. And here just how the first principles are articulated in this argument. He goes on, for 50 years, they've kept this court at the center of a political battle that it can never resolve. And 50 years on, they stand alone. Nowhere else does this court recognize a right to end a human life. Okay, so that's the principle here, right? That's pretty plainly stated, the right to end a human life. There are some implicit premises in there, right? Things like when I said in the Declaration of Independence that saying your rights are endowed by a creator sort of assumes other first principles, such as that there is a creator, right? The idea that Roe and Casey recognize the right to end a human life contains within it the first principle that a fetus is a human life, right? That a human life is growing in the womb of the mother. So that's the first principle, pretty plainly stated. And he goes on, Roe and Casey's core holding, according to those courts, is that the people can protect an unborn girl's life when she just barely can survive outside the womb, but not any earlier when she needs a little more help. That is the world under Roe and Casey. So there's the argument for the pro-life side. Again, a very bedrock argument, right, which takes certain things for granted, one of which is that this is a human person. And therefore, by the text of the Declaration, by the constitutional order of our republic, by the whole burden of our traditions and regime, right? This is a person that is protected by the law. The right to life is inalienable, it comes from God, protected by the government. Okay, so this is Julie Reichelman on behalf of the respondents, which is to say the pro-choice or pro-abortion side. She says, first, there's three reasons why we should uphold Roe and Casey. Stare decisis presents an especially high bar here. In Casey, this court carefully examined and rejected every possible reason for overruling Roe, holding that a woman's right to end a pregnancy before viability was a rule of law and a component of liberty it could not renounce. The question then is not whether Roe should be overturned, but whether Casey was egregiously wrong to adhere to Roe's central holding. Second, Casey and Roe were correct. For a state to take control of a woman's body and demand that she go through pregnancy and childbirth with all the physical risks and life-altering consequences that brings is a fundamental deprivation of her liberty. Preserving a woman's right to make this decision until viability protects her liberty while logically balancing the other interests at stake. Third, eliminating or reducing the right to abortion will propel women backwards. 2 generations now have relied on this right, and 1 out of every 4 women makes the decision to end a pregnancy. So, let's talk about the implicit premises here, right? If the implicit premise in the pro-life side or the choosing whether or not to ban abortion in the state's side, the pro-life side's implicit premise is imago Dei, is this is a person, right? The person has a right to life in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence. People have the right to life. It comes from God. Here is the premise that lies just underneath, right? A lot of these arguments by Reichelman on behalf of the pro-abortion side. First of all, precedent, right? This is something that we have decided. The courts decided it's settled law, as I believe Trump said about this, and eliminating it will propel women backwards, right? That we've gained all of this progress, and Justice Sotomayor sort of echoed this later on, and that it is an undue compromise of liberty, right, on the woman to, as Reichelman puts it, to force her to go through pregnancy. Now, it should be said that the Mississippi law contains carve-outs, right, for some of the more difficult cases. And one of the things that we are currently trying to get, right, is the right to argue over those carve-outs in the states, right, among people who can agree together on American principles. Can we argue about, like, what are the carve-outs? What are some edge cases, some extreme situations where we might make an exception? That's federalism. That's Republican government, right? But since there are those carve-outs already in the Mississippi law, it must be part of the reasoning of the pro-abortion side that all fetuses, no matter whether there are extenuating circumstances, but all fetuses before 24 weeks, before that viability line, are not persons. That is, they are not protected by the Imago Dei, by the right to life. That is why I call this the clump of cells argument, is that when you peel back the layers and understand what the first principle is here, right? And first principles famously are often kind of taken for granted. So they're actually not stated here quite as explicitly, right? But the idea here is that before 24 weeks, that being, right, is a person, or rather not a person, that is a being whose right to life is not stronger than the woman's right to liberty and autonomy. When we weigh questions of liberty, when we compromise people's liberty in this country, one of the reasons that we might do it is because it infringes on somebody else's inalienable rights. And so the pro-life side basically says you are infringing on the inalienable right of the person in the womb, right, to live. And just because your liberty wants to extend beyond that right, it can't, right? And so in order to combat that, although it is somewhat concealed, right, the pro-abortion side has to say that this is not a person who does not have an inalienable right to life, and therefore the liberty of the mother is not to be curtailed in any way. That is why, even though, in court, right, these arguments come forward in a much more measured way, because that is the logic, because that is the first principle, that's why we've moved from safe, legal, and rare into shout your abortion, right? Into this just like, my abortion is great, I have no regrets, I'm proud of it. I mean, these are the same people who staged this kind of demonstration outside the court that you would, they took abortion pills. Their website has this abortion pills forever thing. And so this is essentially what's going on here is we're having a foundational conflict over the claim that this is a clump of cells versus the claim that this is a person. What does the Western tradition have to say about that question? And I truly, although I have an opinion on this, I am asking that in sincerity. What kind of arguments are have been had in the past that might guide us in this question between whether a fetus is a person or whether it's a clump of cells? Let's get into that. I want to tell you guys about what a great experience I had with Paint Your Life. This is a service that takes a photograph of something that really means a lot to you. It could be your best friend, it could be the love of your life, or a memory that you have from a vacation that you really want to preserve. And it's a really lovely way to get a physical, memorialized version of something that might otherwise just kind of languish in your phone in digital form. They did a beautiful job painting by hand this picture of my cat from when he was a kitten. That's a great example of something you can do. They make great gifts, but you can also just find something from your own life that you really want to decorate your home, your office, or whatever. It's really quick. You can get your portrait in as little as 2 weeks, which is awesome. And there's little to no risk, because if you don't love the final painting, your money back is guaranteed. But I think you are going to love it. And there's a great offer for Young Heretics listeners. If you text the word heretics, Heretics, to 64,000, then you'll get 20% off. That's a big discount. Just when you text the word heretics to 64,000, that's heretics to 64,000 at Paint Your Life. Celebrate the moments that matter most. Terms apply. They are available at paintyourlife.com/terms. One more time, just text heretics to 64,000 to get a personalized painting of your favorite photo for 20% off. So if you do a Control F search, if you try to find words in these oral arguments, which you can find online, you can find them written out online. If you hit Control F and you type words into the search bar, one word you will not find anywhere in the pro-life or the pro-abortion arguments is the word soul. the word soul is nowhere mentioned. The word that is mentioned fairly often is life, right? Is this fetus alive? Does it have life? And one of the things that I've been suggesting throughout this two-part series is that our first principle questions are concealed by our language because we don't admit that there's such a thing as having certain axioms, certain principles that are just true no matter what. Using the word life to talk about this question is basically a way of sweeping under the rug the question of the soul. When we talk about life, we're really just talking about what the ancients meant when they used the word psyche, which we now translate as soul. But it's the capacity to feel, right, to exist, to love, to move around, right, to seek nourishment. All of these things were attributed in the ancient world to the soul, and it survives even though we don't admit it. That idea survives now in our word psyche. And that sounds more medical and more scientific because it comes from Freud and all these, psychoanalysts. But in fact, psyche is just a translation of the word soul. And when we talk about life, we're really talking about the existence of the soul, which is why when you turn to ancient discussions of abortion, the soul is exactly the question. When does the soul enter the body? That is a profound philosophical question. There's a lot of humility in the ancient writings about it that I think we could use, right, when we make these proclamations. But let us talk about the reasoning that the ancients used to discuss whether or not the fetus has a soul, because as the body comes into being, so too the soul comes into being. We know this is true, right? We know that the soul and the body are kind of wed and knit together, that God breathed into the clay, and when the breath of life entered the clay, then it became a living soul. And so this Christian premise, right, is what informs that discussion that ancient Christians and ancient pagans as well had about abortion, and it's still informing our discussion, but as a hidden first principle. All of these discussions that we have about, well, can you do it, in these extreme cases? Can you do it in an unhealthy environment? Can you do it in a healthy environment? Will people just use coat hangers, right? All of these, as I have just shown, boil down underneath. They conceal this secret argument about first principles. Where does the soul live? Is there a soul? Is there a soul in the fetus? So there are a few passages, actually, that people tend to cite, and I want to read them to you so that you can, first of all, know what the tradition is of talking about this question, but also because these passages sometimes get cited without any context as evidence that, there was, more common sense on abortion in the ancient world or something. It's a little more complicated than that. So here's Tertullian. We've encountered Tertullian before. He's from North Africa. He's one of the great Latin fathers, the Christian fathers that wrote in Latin, 2nd century AD. And he writes this treatise De Anima, which is the name of a work by Aristotle as well, on the soul, right? And it's a discussion of the nature of the soul. And in the discussing the nature of the soul, he comes up against abortion. And he talks about the soul in the womb. He says, I will now return to the cause of this digression. He's just been talking about something else. He says, in order that I may explain how all souls are derived from one. This is chapter 25 of Tertullian's De Anima, when and where and in what manner they are produced. Now, touching this subject, it matters not whether the question be started by the philosopher, the heretic, or the crowd. Those who profess the truth care nothing about their opponents, especially such of them as begin by maintaining that the soul is not conceived in the womb, nor is formed and produced at that time that the flesh is molded. Now, this is rather interesting. What Tertullian is telling us is that there was a prevailing view in antiquity. Lots of people believed that the soul entered the body after birth. This is exactly a thing that you will hear argued now, right? That when the baby comes into being, then suddenly it is invested with meaning and love, right? And now that it's born, we can protect it and care about it, but in the womb we don't, right? Apparently, that's an ancient view, right? That the soul is not formed and produced at the time the flesh is molded, but is impressed from without upon the infant before his complete vitality, but after the process of parturition. They say, moreover, that the human seed, having been duly deposited ex concubiter in the womb, and having been by natural impulse quickened, it becomes condensed into the mere substance of the flesh, which is in due time born, warm from the furnace of the womb, and then released from its heat. Now, I want to make a distinction here as we start getting into these ancient questions of biology and psychology, right? Because typically, in our chronological chauvinism, which is our dismissal of people that went before us, right? We say, well, these guys didn't know what we know about human biology and so forth. And that's actually true, right? I mean, they did have doctors, and Tertullian has read the medical literature of his time. He cites it frequently. But they didn't know what we know. They didn't have ultrasounds. And so what we are looking for here is not accurate information about fetal development. What we are looking for is sound philosophical reasoning about soul development, spiritual development. And those two things can be distinct from one another. You can know more about how the body works and less about how the soul works, which is basically the position we're in now. So don't write Tertullian off just because he's talking about, kind of ancient medical ideas, right? Flesh resembles the case of hot iron, he says, which is in that state plunged into cold water. For, being smitten by the cold air into which it is born, it at once receives the power of animation and utters vocal sound. This view is entertained by the Stoics, along with Nicodemus and occasionally Plato himself, when he tells us that the soul, being quite a separate formation originating elsewhere and externally to the womb, is inhaled when the newborn infant first draws breath. This is exactly what radical abortion advocates now say, that the baby becomes a person outside the womb, right? He's citing all these Greek philosophers and saying they too believe that the soul has nothing to do with the body. It just gets dumped in when we get born. We might remember the Timaeus, where the soul is kind of like shoved into this physical body, right? I think he's a little unfair to Plato here, but he's basically saying this is a view that exists, right? And by and by exhaled with the man's latest breath. Soul is just breath. We breathe it when we come out of the womb. We exhale it when we die. We shall see whether this view of his is merely fictitious. Even the medical profession has not lacked its Hychesius to prove a traitor both to nature and his own calling. These gentlemen, I suppose, were too modest to come to terms with women on the mysteries of childbirth, so well known to the latter. But how much more is there for them to blush when in the end they have the women to refute them instead of condemning them? He's saying, listen to women, #believe women. Now, in such a question as this, no one can be so useful as a teacher, judge, or witness as the sex itself, which is so intimately concerned. Give us your testimony then, you mothers, whether yet pregnant or after delivery. Let barren women and men keep silence. No uterus, no opinion, right? You hear this yelled in the abortion debate all the time, but this is the opposite, right? Because of course Tertullian is saying, there is something that only pregnant mothers can know, but it's not, right, the whole absolute question of whether abortion is right or wrong. They have direct evidence of what it is like to have a baby inside of them. And so he's asking them for direct accounting of exactly the thing which they know and know more, right? This is why when we talk about lived experience, right, it's always only a half truth, because yes, there are people who have experiences, right, that they can tell us about that we don't know about. But that does not mean that they therefore have knowledge, right, of the highest truth. It just means they have something to contribute to our search for the highest truth. So on this point, Tertullian is saying, no uterus, no opinion, right? And indeed, no children, no opinion. Barren women and men keep silence. The truth of your own nature is in question. The reality of your own suffering is the point to be decided. As a side note, how different would our abortion debate be if one of the things we said was no children, no opinion, right? No, not only no uterus, but no children, no opinion is a very different thing to say. Tertullian says, tell us then whether you feel in the embryo within you any vital force other than your own, with which your bowels tremble, your sides shake, your entire womb throbs, and the burden which oppresses you constantly changes its position. Are these moments a joy to you and a positive removal of anxiety, as making you confident that your infant both possesses vitality and enjoys it? Or, should his restlessness cease, your first fear would be for him, and he would be aware of it within you, since he is disturbed at the novel sound, and you would crave for injurious diet or would even loathe your food, all on his account. Then you and he, in the closeness of your sympathy, would share together your common ailments, so far that with your contusions and bruises would he actually become marked, while within you, and even on the selfsame parts of the body, taking to himself thus peremptorily the injuries of the mother. He's saying, moms, when you feel the baby move inside you, is that you or is that somebody else? You know who that is, right? That's another being. And of course, mothers know this intimately. They understand the character of their babies almost from the womb somehow, right? You talk to mothers and they're like, this one's a fighter, or this one's a really introspective. They have these crazy opinions about their babies in the womb, and the baby comes out and it's like, sure enough, like, but more fundamentally, right? If the baby stops moving, is that you stopping moving, or are you worried about the baby, right? Tertullian is using these sort of common sense arguments from the experience of women who are pregnant. He's probably also thinking of the visit that Mary made to Elizabeth when she was pregnant with Jesus, and Elizabeth was pregnant with John the Baptist, that John the Baptist leapt up in the womb, right? So there is account of this in the Bible. But fundamentally, he's saying, right, this is another being that is inside you. And so the question is, right, when is that another being with its own capacity for motion? And so now we come up on this ancient idea of what's called the quickening. And that is a word that is used to describe, right, when the body becomes, as it were, alive, infused with the ability to move for itself. And they didn't know exactly when this was, but they had a lot of theories about it, right? So he's saying there is no disease where there is no soul or principle of life. Again, inasmuch as sustenance by food and the want thereof, growth and decay, fear and motion are conditions of the soul or life, he who experiences them must be alive. If you can feel pain, if you can move around, if your heart beats, you are alive. Mark well, Tertullian is saying, if you can move, you have a soul. What he is not saying necessarily is that if you can't move, you don't have a soul, right? We're talking here about something that is developing, coming into being. He says, he at last ceases to live who ceases to experience them. And thus, by and by, infants are still born. But how so? Unless they had life. For how could any die who had not previously lived? But sometimes by a cruel necessity, while yet in the womb, an infant is put to death. When lying awry in the orifice of the womb, he impedes parturition and kills his mother if he is not to die himself. Accordingly, among surgeons' tools, there is a certain instrument which is formed with a nicely adjusted flexible frame for opening the uterus first of all and keeping it open. It is further furnished with an annular blade, by means of which the limbs within the womb are dissected with anxious but unfaltering care, its last appendage being a blunted or covered hook wherewith the entire fetus is extracted by a violent delivery. I apologize for the graphic nature of this, but it is remarkable how similar this instrument is to the more gruesome instruments of the abortion industry, right? There is also another instrument in the shape of a copper needle. He goes on to describe it. They give it, from its infanticidal function, the name of Embryosphactes, the slayer of the infant. And he's saying they acknowledge by the name that this is what they are doing. Now, here is an example of a morally responsible and sophisticated discussion of abortion edge cases, sometimes by a cruel necessity, while yet in the womb, if he impedes parturition and kills his mother if he is not to die himself. This is one of the classic edge cases that we discuss. Tertullian is acknowledging the tragic nature of this, but one of the things he's doing is he's having that discussion within the context of the first principle that this is a being with a soul, and therefore what's happening is that somebody is being killed, right? There is no room for shout your abortion in this, even if, right, you're going to point to Tertullian as somebody that acknowledges the sometimes extreme necessities of edge cases, right? There is no room for shout your abortion precisely because he's saying, right, the very fact that we regard this as an act of infanticide shows us that we have an intuition that this being which moves inside of us is a being which has a soul. People sometimes cite in this context Ovid, who's an Augustine pagan poet, right, a Roman poet, the Ars Amatoria. He evinces a similar understanding, right? That this is a violation of nature, right? This is kind of a given understanding, right? That if you feel that you have to do this, you must at least acknowledge that what you are doing is killing a baby, right? This is, to me, right, again, being a pro-life extremist, this is the best version of the pro-abortion argument, is the one that acknowledges that you're killing a person and just plunks for sometimes you have to kill a person, right? I don't really agree with that, but I can see how you would make that argument in extreme cases. But because at least it's acknowledging the first principles, right, and having that discussion. These are the kinds of conversations that we could have, right, within local communities that could be made to acknowledge the first principles that this country was founded on. Here's Ovid. This is book 2 of the Ars Amatoria, part 14. Whoever first taught the destruction of a tender fetus deserved to die by her own warlike methods. No doubt you'd chance your arm in that dismal arena just to keep your belly free of wrinkles with your crime. If the same practice had pleased mothers of old, humanity would have been destroyed by that violation. He's identifying here, right, the shout your abortion crowd, the crowd that would deprive itself of the fetus just, to keep itself from getting pregnant and ugly, right? I mean, this is the clump of cells version. This is like, your life is of no account in my womb if it would impede, just my career or my progress. Right? So you see, even in the ancient world, that these views are distinct from one another once you understand both the first principles within which they have to proceed and the different arguments that you can make from different points of beginning. Ovid is referring to very much to our modern shout your abortion crowd, to the clump of cells first principles, as compared with, right, Tertullian is talking within the Imago Dei tradition. Tertullian is talking about, if this is a soul, right, then here are the conditions under which we might talk about this baby dying. Now, having acknowledged the severity of this debate, right, and understanding that that's the context within which we should be having this discussion, right, we can see how far that discussion is from the Supreme Court arguments, right, which start to spiral off into these questions of like, whether the woman is inconvenienced, right? And all of those things are supremely beside the point, because the first principles at play are different on either side. It's like tectonic plates that are moving totally past one another and producing these violent eruptions precisely because they're not on the same tracks. They're not moving on the same tracks. Let me read you another line of questioning from that same oral argument section, and this is from Justice Sotomayor. You have probably noticed, and indeed, how could you not have noticed, that everything is getting more expensive? The government is printing money like there's no tomorrow. A great way to offset this is with American Hartford Gold. One of the best ways to shore up your assets is to put some of them into real physical gold and silver. American Hartford Gold can show you how to hedge your hard-earned savings against inflation by helping you diversify a portion of your portfolio into physical gold and silver. They make it super easy. I am not an economically literate person, and they did a great job for me. They are the highest rated firm in the country with an A+ rating from the BBB and thousands of satisfied clients. If you are a Young Heretics listener, for listeners only, you can get an excellent deal. If you call them right now, they will give you up to $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. This is a crucial component of building our Young Heretics empire of incredibly jacked, incredibly handsome, incredibly well-read, and fabulously wealthy conquerors of the world. American Hartford Gold can help. Don't wait. Call them now. You call 866-781-7499 or text HERETICS, HERETICS, to 65532. So text HERETICS to 65532 and you will get $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. You got to use that code. So text HERETICS to 65532 to begin building your vast empire of wealth and gold. Okay, so here's Justice Sonia Sotomayor, one of the Supreme Court justices. I'm going to leave aside all of the ways that I'm tempted to make fun of her. I'm just going to read her question about the idea that a fetus, a pre-viable fetus, might feel pain. And this is based in large part on the reaction of fetuses in the womb to pain stimulus, right? And Sotomayor is saying virtually every state defines a brain death as a death. Yet, the literature is filled with episodes of people who are completely and utterly brain dead, responding to stimuli. There's about 40% of dead people who, if you touch their feet, the foot will recoil. There are spontaneous acts by brain dead people. So I don't think that a response by a fetus necessarily proves that there's a sensation of pain or that there's consciousness. Sotomayor, again, unstated, but is effectively saying, right, that this is a clump of cells that operates according to biological machinery. That just as if you put an electrode to a conductor and you will get a shock, right? If you poke a fetus, you will get a sort of spontaneous chemical reaction. That's all this is. It's just like a brain dead person, right? And using a kind of legal legerdemain, right? Using this sort of legal technicality that brain dead people are dead, right? Which they're obviously not dead in the final sense, or we wouldn't call them brain dead, right? There's clearly a sort of there's casuistry going on here, but saying that this is death, right? You say this is basically the same thing as a fetus. It's a lump of flesh that if you poke it, it jumps, right? And there is no acknowledgement there, right? That this might be a soul in embryo. That is to say that, yeah, of course it doesn't have the capacities of the highly developed soul that a human being outside the womb does, right? But that's not the question at all. The question is whether this is a soul which will eventually develop, right? Which is growing by its nature, naturally, by physis, into a being. That's why I say that these oral arguments, whatever debates we might have about abortion in the states, right, outside the context of the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, what you saw was the rising up of two totally separate first principles, the Imago Dei first principle and the lump of flesh first principle. Poke it jumps just because it's a chemistry set, just because it's got electricity in it, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about this distinction between, do we believe that there is a soul and that it enters into the body at conception? Or do we believe that this is effectively a clump of flesh like any other, and that, that by effectively we just sort of, according to our convenience, we define certain lumps of flesh as alive and certain lumps of flesh as not. Let's talk now about that debate in antiquity, because as I've mentioned, right, there is a history of talking about this in the ancient world. I just talked about the question, right, whether you can have abortion debates and discussions within the Imago Dei first principles. Now let's talk about this discussion, when does life begin? That is, when does the soul enter the body? Because again, the question, when does life begin, is a sort of covert, coded way of talking about the soul, which we feel uncomfortable talking about because we don't really believe in first principles, even though we have them, right? So in the ancient world and in early Christianity, this debate largely proceeds in commentary on the verses that I read to you at the beginning of this episode and the last one. That's why I've been stressing this Exodus 21, verse 22 verse. I'm going to read it to you one more time, and then we will see why it is that this is the source of the soul at conception debate. So Exodus 21:22. If men strive together and hurt a woman with child so that her fruit depart and yet no harm follow, she shall be surely fined, according as the woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follow, thou shalt give life for life. So these two verses define two different legal eventualities, two different possible outcomes. Men are fighting. In the process of fighting, they hurt a woman. She's with child. And in one sense, in one option, we have Vyatsu Yilda, right? That her fruit would go out of her. But Velo Yihya Ason, but there is no harm. And this is taken to mean, and the tradition interprets it this way. It's not abundantly obvious to me that that's the case, but the tradition interprets this to mean this is a miscarriage before viability, or before the fetus has been formed in the womb. Alternatively, verse 23, va'im ason, but if there is harm, right, then you give life for life, because then it's a life. And so essentially the Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and early Christians and then medieval Christians were arguing over, right, is this a distinction between when the fetus has a soul and when it does not? And there are Talmudic sources that sort of bear on this as well. But here's what Augustine has to say on commenting on this verse. He says, the text continues saying, if the child is formed, he will give life for life. This is his translation based on the tradition that, like, if the child is formed, if it has a soul, if it moves, you die for having killed the child because you've taken a life, right? What else does this last phrase mean? But he himself will die, because the law imposes this in the other cases mentioned with this motive: eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruising. He's saying if you've killed a viable fetus, or if you've killed a fetus that is rather with a soul, then you've taken a life, and your life shall be taken. That is the justice of retaliation. And this law was established to show what kind of punishment should be applied. Because if it were not known by law what kind of punishment had to be applied, where would we know what punishment would remove the forgiveness to be able to say, forgive us our debts just as we our debtors? The law, in effect, reveals the debtors, so that when something is forgiven, it appears what is forgiven. For we would not forgive the debts if we did not know by law what is owed to us. Therefore, if that birth had already existed, but was still somehow animated without form, because the great problem of the soul does not have to be resolved hastily with the recklessness of an uncontested sentence, the law has not wanted it to be a homicide, because it cannot still be called a living soul that is in a body that lacks senses, if it is thus in a flesh not formed and therefore not yet endowed with senses. So what he's saying is, we did not want to hastily resolve this profound philosophical question in the context of a live court case, which is what this Exodus text must have come out of. And hard cases make bad law. And so the Augustine is basically saying, we know once the body is moving in the womb, once it has quickening, then we know it has a soul. And so that's when we can confidently take the life of somebody that kills a woman's baby, right? And therefore, the law errs on the side of leniency and does not take the life of somebody before we know that the infant has a soul. There's a kind of agnosticism about this. We don't know. We know that human beings have souls. We know it comes in the womb. Augustine elsewhere says that all abortion is bad, right? Because it stops the giving of life. We know that this comes from some of the earliest Christian writings, the Didache 2 and 5:2, letter of Barnabas, 19:5, right? Do not take the life of the fetus by abortion. It is the work of God. So that's the baseline here, is that it's bad to take the life of the fetus. Augustine is saying, well, we don't know when it constitutes homicide, essentially. So he's saying we always shouldn't do it, but we punish it in Exodus, right, once it reaches the level of homicide. He's talking, by the way, not about the mother, right, but about somebody that is fighting another man and causes the death of a woman's fetus. So this, in the context of this discussion, he says, basically, this is when we know. We know when it's moving, just like Tertullian says, when it's moving, you know it's a being. You know it has a soul. Very common sense, direct attitude. Aquinas has much the same idea. So we're going to get to him in a second. You are surely wondering how Soundfront hires all of this incredible talent besides me to make this podcast. The answer is Indeed. Indeed is your one-stop shop hiring service. Any business that you are running, you are successful in because you love doing the research, whether it's the state of the market or the next right hire. But when you're low on hours and you still want to do a great job on hiring, Indeed are the people you go to for help. You need Indeed because it is the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applications that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay. They have this thing called Instant Match. So as soon as you sponsor a post, you get a short list of quality candidates with resumes on Indeed that match your job description. Soundfront does an incredible job hiring excellent talent, and they couldn't do it without the help of Indeed. They post their job requests, and everything is taken care of for them. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/heretics. This is only for listeners, a deal at Indeed.com/heretics, $75 sponsored job credit. Go to Indeed.com/heretics and claim your $75 credit. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire. You need Indeed. Here's Thomas Aquinas, great medieval theologian, on basically the same question, commenting on the same verse. Second half, the second part, question 64, Article 8, in reply to objection 2. It always takes longer to cite Aquinas than it does to actually read what he says. But Aquinas says, "He that strikes a woman with child does something unlawful. Wherefore, if there results the death either of the woman or of the animated fetus, that is the quickened fetus or the fetus that has the capacity of motion, he will not be excused from homicide, especially seeing that death is the natural result of such a blow." So again, describing this Exodus law that if you're fighting and you kill a fetus, you are liable for homicide once we know that the fetus is moving around. Aquinas has basically what I call the build-a-soul model of conception and of birth, of growth in the womb and birth, right? I call it build-a-soul, like out of those Build-A-Bear workshops, right? Where you have like a sort of empty stuffed animal and you fill it with fluff and then you put different stuff on it. Following the ancient tradition, Aquinas has 3 parts of the soul: the nutritive part, the spirited part, and the intellectual part. And he associates these with life that is just seeking nourishment, getting nourishment, and living. That's the nutritive part, just like plants have a nutritive part of the soul. And then moving around, right, being able to choose to move and all that. And then the intellectual soul, which is the rational soul, which can reason at a high level and can make fully fledged ethical choices. Aquinas believes that the ovum, the female egg, has a nutritive soul. That is, it takes in nourishment. And that the man, by exerting the motion of his body, gives it this kind of motion, the motive part of the soul. And that's why semen can move, right? Can swim around. All makes a certain degree of sense. Then at a certain point, when the fetus can move around, that's when the man's motive power has infused the nutritive soul with a kind of motive power, and you have this sort of second stage of build-a-soul. But he argues the intellectual part has to come from outside, that is from God, right? So you get nutritive soul from woman, motive soul from man, intellectual soul from God. This is typically portrayed as this, backwards misogynistic thing, but it's basically just a description of where do these different principles of life come from. So the embryo always has a soul. It's a question of how developed that soul is when it comes into being, and therefore, right, these kinds of arguments, these edge case arguments that we might have in Exodus about when you could take the life of a man for killing a fetus in the womb. You see how different this kind of argument is, right? And again, what I am not trying to say to you here is that, all the tradition agrees with me. Like everybody, Aquinas and Augustine and Tertullian and all these people, right? They all think exactly what I think. They all want exactly what I want for American 21st century politics. Do not understand me to be saying that. All I am trying to point out to you is that in this tradition of arguing about abortive edge cases, right, there is a very live discussion and debate and certain unknowns, right, among the ancient Christians about when the soul becomes like a fully human soul. They are able to have that discussion because they share the first principle that every human soul is made in the image of God. Only one side of the debate in the Supreme Court showed that it had those first principles. That is why I'm being so hard on the pro-abortion side of that debate, is because it's obviously motivated by a totally different set of first principles, the clump of cell first principles. And if we are going to have a meaningful discussion about abortion in this country, And if we're going to save our souls, we are going to have to plunk for one of those first principles and not the other. There is no room for shout your abortion in a meaningful discussion because it is founded on the clump of cells, Sonia Sotomayor, poke it, it moves form of first principles. We must plunk for American first principles, which are Imago Dei first principles, stretching all the way back through the whole Christian tradition and before, back to Genesis, that every human being is made in the image of God and therefore has an inalienable right to life. Once we accept that together, if Dobbs goes the way that we hope, and if we can get enough people to agree on that basic premise, then we can have arguments in the states. I know this is an incredibly painful and difficult argument for everybody involved. I know that there are situations in which horrible pain occurs. I know that rape exists in this world. Believe me, you will not find a more pessimistic person than me about the state of humanity and the fallenness of the world. I do not contest any of that, and I know that we can acknowledge the sorrow and the suffering and the difficulty that sometimes comes with unwanted pregnancies. I do not mean to suggest that any of that is wrong. All I am saying is that if we are going to have a discussion about that, we must first acknowledge that what has resulted from even the most tragic edge case is the existence of a human life endowed by its creator with the inalienable right to live. Once we agree on that, then we can talk. If we don't agree, all we can do is fight. That is the power of first principles. That is the power of faith in the sense of pistis, in the sense of the baseline groundwork that we are supposed to be talking in. We've been denied the right to talk like Americans about this, because what Americans do is they agree on the first principles of the Declaration of Independence, and then they discuss in their local communities how they are going to live as best they can in the prudential light of those principles. Can we talk like that? I don't know, but I pray that we can. And that is the question of abortion. It's also the question of everything else we're discussing. It's the question of coronavirus. It's the question of civil war in this country. It's the question of protectionism versus isolationism. All of this is about whether we believe in the Declaration of Independence, whether we might like to go to church or not. We don't have a choice because we live in a country that was founded on the idea of a creator who endows us with the right to life. And unless we acknowledge that, and unless we come in sorrow to the rare cases in which we might need to consider ending a fetal life, right, then we will never have an abortion debate that is humane or serious. That's the end of this series on first principles and the abortion debate. It's a heavy topic, but I'm glad that we raised it because really I think we can't even proceed a step before we agree on these basic ideas. Have you ever scrolled through your credit card bill and just found a ton of charges from stuff you don't use? The solution to this is Truebill. Subscription services are really canny about this. They'll offer you like this incredible deal, a month free, a whole year free, right? And then you use the service and you sort of forget about it and maybe you're not into it anymore, but they just keep your credit card information and they roll you right over to a paid subscription. And that is how you end up paying things like $720 a year of unused subscriptions. Truebill is super easy to use. All they do is just scroll through the money that you're spending on things that you do not use and help you to cancel them. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. You got to go to that link, truebill.com/heretics. It could save you thousands a year. They save me a bundle, and I've heard stories of people that are saving like hundreds of dollars. Matthew B., here's a testimonial. Matthew B. says, in a matter of seconds, I saved $660 for the year on my DirecTV bill, $120 for the year on my Sirius XM bill, and $840 a year on car insurance. I'm no mathematician, but that is a lot of money to be saving every year. So go to truebill.com/heretics so you can start building the vast Young Heretics empire. You want to be able to join in taking over the world for the Young Heretics empire. And in order to do that, you got to go to truebill.com/heretics and start saving thousands a year on unused subscriptions. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, which is the only place where you can ask me mailbag questions. It's also the only place where you can ask questions for the live stream Q&As that I do every week. You can get exclusive articles there, and you can become a part of a really profound community that is, in engaged discussion over how to take these first principles that we hopefully share as inheritors of the Western tradition, how to apply them to life, how to live them out. It's a really wonderful community. I would love to see you there. You can get a month free right now when you go to youngheretics.com/locals, sign up for the annual membership, and then use the offer code PISTIS, PISTIS, which is that Greek word for faith, belief, and first principles. One more time, it's youngheretics.com/locals. Use the offer code PISTIS. Now, here's a question from Socks Nation. In an office hour several months ago, I asked you whether you thought we were in a stasis in Corcyra moment, and you essentially said you didn't think we were there yet. In the latest American Mind podcast, The Hunkening, you explicitly raised Corcyra when discussing the left's rewriting of the terms race and racism as part of the discussion about Whoopi Goldberg. Have you changed your mind about our being in a stasis in Corcyra moment? If not, why not? Thanks. Okay, so this is part of a discussion that we've been having on Locals among VIPs. The stasis of Corcyra, the civil war, and the island of Corcyra was part of the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides has this wonderful, shocking, terrifying passage that during civil war, the meanings of words were changed in an effort to grab power, that people take power, people who want to take illegitimate power often redefine words. I've talked about this in the context of, freedom is slavery, war is peace, men are women, men can get pregnant. Any time that you see somebody trying to say that X means Y, that something we've agreed upon means the opposite of what we'd agreed it means. Abortion is about choice, right? That's another example of trying to obfuscate over first principles, seize control over the debate. And Sox Nation is taking me to task and saying, I have said before that I don't think we're in the point of actual physical violent civil war over this. But I have also said in the American Mind and elsewhere that this dynamic is going on, right? This dynamic of trying to seize control over words. Now, I think that both of these things can be true. And let me say how I think it can be true. Once you are coming to physical blows over your politics, you have entered into what is really stasis, which is to say that the effort to seize control over language has become so acute and intense and has so totally broken down that all you can do is physically get into fistfights. What I believe is that there are factions in our country that are attempting to get us to that point. They don't know necessarily that that's where they are leading, right? But when you have people saying like our democracy depends on shutting down, local insurrectionist communities, by which they simply mean, just like Trump voters, basically, then they are redefining words in an effort to gain power to control others. Once that is a complete or successful breakdown, that is, once you have totally scrambled the meaning of words so that no rational discussion is possible, then the only logical next step is that people are going to feel as if they have to fight physically with one another in order to get their way. And I think that the outbreaks that we've had of civil violence, when I talk about those, right, I'm saying essentially like, I don't approve of them, but it doesn't matter if you approve of them because they're what you get, right? They're what you get when you start to confuse the meaning of words in order to gain power. When you pull out the rug of shared common meaning under society and just make everything about narrative and the assertion of power. I think that there is a radical leftist faction in this country that wants to do that completely and is therefore flirting with stasis. But to be flirting with stasis is not the same thing, right, as to be actually in a civil war where people are taking up arms against one another. It's a much uglier and bloodier business. If you read that whole description of the stasis of Corcyra, people are perverting temples and just mass murder is going on all over the place. We're simply not in that place yet, and I would be alarmist to suggest that we are. I hope that I haven't. But this is exactly why I answered this question now while we're talking about first principles, is because one of the things that obscuring your first principles does is it enables you to basically change the meaning of words, right? Like we're the pro-choice movement, right? Everybody's in favor of choice, right? Everybody involved is in favor of women having the right to choose within the limits of ordered liberty. The question is whether one of those limits is the life of the fetus in her womb, the life of the baby in her womb, right? Now, absolutely, there is a kind of stasis-esque chaos, right, that is implied by the kinds of fights that we have. And that is why this debate gets so heated and intense. But until we're actually taking up arms against one another, we ain't in stasis. Our stasis, of course, we're in the like brewing phase, right, of the kinds of forces that lead to stasis, lead to civil war. But we are certainly not in civil war. You'll know when we are, if we are. I pray we never get there. Hope that helps. Thanks for the question. Once again, if you want to become a VIP, go to youngheretics.com/locals. Use the offer code PISTIS, PISTIS, and get a month off your annual subscription. That's it from me. If you like this show, if you think this message needs to be shared, I implore you to share it. This show, the success, the existence of this show depends on you. I'm always so grateful when I see people tweeting about the show or putting it on Instagram. Don't stop. Keep doing that, please, and spread the word out. Let people know that they can get Young Heretics wherever they listen to podcasts. And go check out the Claremont Institute, where I work. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. You can find them both online, and you can donate to help support our work in defense of the American idea at claremont.org/donate. Thanks again for listening. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.